Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conservation International's webinar titled Nature and Climate, a Critical Moment for Global Action. We're delighted to have you with us today. My name is Elle Lewis, and I'm the Senior Director of Special Events at Conservation International. Before introducing our host and moderator for today's discussion, I want to go over a few housekeeping items to ensure this event runs smoothly. Upon joining, all attendees will be muted automatically, and your camera will be turned off and remain off for the duration of the event. In the interest of time, we've disabled the chat function, but we hope this conversation will be a starting point for future engagement on the importance of nature and climate agendas on the road to COP30. If you'd like to listen to the webinar in Spanish, please click Interpretation from the toolbar along the bottom of your screen and select Spanish from the dropdown. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all attendees after the presentation. It is my honor to introduce our host and moderator, Carlos Correa. Carlos is Colombia's former Minister of the Environment and currently a Lui-Walton Senior Fellow at Conservation International. Carlos provides strategic counsel for CI's leadership on institutional priorities around topics such as natural climate solutions, ocean conservation at scale, and nature-positive economies through a just and inclusive approach. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carlos.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And it's an honor to have you join our webinar series for the first time or once again. Today, we will discuss the topic of nature and climate as we face a critical moment for global action. I start this webinar by mentioning that 2024 was the warmest year on record globally, at the first calendar year that the average global temperature exceeded 1.5 above its pre-industrial level. We made meaningful strides at last year's COP on biodiversity, climate, and desertification, alongside other alliances and initiatives to advance the well-being of both people and nature. However, more ambitious is needed, and we must work to break down silos in the negotiations and adopt a more unified approach to achieve a shared vision. So today we will hear from experts like Lina Barrera, Ignace Beguin, and Calder Tsuyuki-Tomlinson on how we can collectively implement effective strategies for preserving our natural world and addressing climate change impacts. So the greatest challenges of our time are intrinsically related, requiring close coordination and transformative collaboration. Today, we will start by hearing from Lina Barrera, who is the Senior Vice President of Global Policy and Government Affairs at Conservation International. She leads Conservation International's work to influence the design and the implementation of international and domestic public policies to ensure that nature and the critical benefits that it provides to humanity are built into public policies and funding priorities. She will provide an overview of how climate and biodiversity policies are moving towards a more integrated agenda. So, Lina, please. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos, for the warm welcome. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for bringing this group together. So, as you say, right, as a global community, we are facing two significant challenges to our well-being: biodiversity loss and climate change. There's significant scientific evidence that these two are interconnected and that protecting and restoring nature can be a solution to both. And at the international scale, we've acknowledged that for a long time, right? The Paris Agreement includes an entire article on the role of forests in addressing climate change, and the Global Biodiversity Framework has a target dedicated to nature and climate. The challenge is that in practice, many countries face challenges in really getting the full benefit from nature-climate synergies, both on action and on funding. The first global stocktake from the Paris Agreement, which was at COP28, told us that the world is not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals, and it specifically pointed out that that's partially due to the lack of investment in nature-based solutions. So the good news is that governments are taking steps to bring these two agendas closer together and making it easier to implement these mutually reinforcing action. They're doing that at both the international and the domestic levels. So let's start with the international arena. The timing for this conversation is ideal because we're part way between some international policy moments, right? The CBD COP16 wrapped up in Rome last month after the sort of first round in Cali in October, and COP29 in Baku was 4 months ago, and now we've got 9 months before we meet up in Belém for the climate COP30. And in this period over the last year, we've definitely some points of progress linking climate and nature agendas at the international level. So first, during the biodiversity COP, both in Cali and then in Rome, countries agreed to align their biodiversity and climate policies at the national level and to prioritize action in key places for biodiversity and climate. So that's a big step forward just in terms of the mental framing that brings to government action. They also agreed to foster more collaboration with other UN conventions like the Climate Convention, which can also sort of help to spur these kinds of collaborations at the national level. Then, during the climate negotiations in Baku, so at COP29, nature was actually explicitly incorporated into a decision on non-market approaches for how countries can work together on mitigation, which is a big deal. It really recognizes sort of the importance of joint mitigation and adaptation approaches that involve both biodiversity and climate action. So really what we're seeing is that there's, continuing and increasing recognition of the biodiversity climate link and a really strong desire for alignment at the international level. And looking ahead to Belém, we see some pretty big opportunities to strengthen that link even further, especially in conversations about financing. So Brazil and Azerbaijan are leading the development of the roadmap to 1.3 trillion, which is the funding need for climate action, and that is intended to be finalized at COP30. And we see it as essential that this roadmap catalyzes significant investment in nature and that it fosters those mutually supportive actions on climate and biodiversity. The reason for that is that, as of 2023, less than half of countries have even a marginal alignment with nature in their nationally determined contributions. And only 12% of them have dedicated budgets to support the delivery of those commitments. So this is a huge missed opportunity, and it's why we want to see nature really fully included in the roadmap to 1.3 trillion. Carbon-rich ecosystems like peatlands, mangroves, wetlands, primary forests, they're all essential for biodiversity and also hold vast stores of carbon. So if we lose too much of that, the carbon they contain could not be resequestered before 2050, which is too late to avoid the worst climate impacts. So as countries work to finalize and implement their NBSAPs and to prepare their third round of NDCs, we see these linkages as even more important than ever. And by designing these national strategies to complement one another, to prioritize protection, management, and restoration of high carbon and biodiversity ecosystems, countries can then realize the full potential of nature as a climate solution, while also minimizing the impact of climate change on nature. At CI, we have a long history of working with countries to align biodiversity and climate policies. We've worked with partners to develop a guide on nature and nationally determined contributions to help countries, really figure out how to do this. We've worked directly with governments as they develop the nature-based components of their NDCs, as well as climate-relevant aspects of their NBSAPs. So we know this can be done. We know that it brings significant benefits for humans as well as our fellow species. So in closing, I'd like to just take a step back and talk a little bit about some of the fundamental issues of why we're not seeing sufficient action on climate and biodiversity. Beyond sort of what does it take for governments to cooperate or ministries to cooperate or how much funding do we have? But even beyond that, currently, we don't really have the right economic incentives in place to drive the level of action that we need, right? We have a lot of incentives in place that encourage the destruction of nature. For example, by rewarding or subsidizing agricultural output or numbers of hectares logged without considering sustainability. Every year, we are spending about 700 billion on subsidies for agriculture and forestry that are meant to help society, but at the same time are creating long-term problems by undermining our environment. We can change that. We can create new positive incentives for nature and climate, including by reforming or repurposing subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity and high carbon ecosystems in a way that still supports livelihoods, but that yields better environmental results. This is actually a highly efficient way to transform our current system into a fair and equitable nature positive economy. And we think it should be a part of every government's consideration as they implement both climate and biodiversity agendas. So thank you, Carlos, for the time and for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, Lina. Great. There's a long journey to set more ambitious and action to protect biodiversity and align with climate mitigation and adaptation, among other agendas. I think that, well, you said a lot of things here, a lot of work to do. We need to do it together. Incentives, national governments, also subnational governments. I always talk about subnational governments and the power of the subnational governments. And well, next up, we will welcome our distinguished panelists to join our conversation about the importance of addressing nature and climate from their perspective. So I will start by introducing Ignace Beguin, a dear friend and colleague who leads the Mangrove Breakthrough Hub, a global initiative that seeks to mobilize 4 billion to protect and restore 50 million hectares of mangroves. Ignace brings extensive experience in building global coalitions that unite businesses, governments, and other stakeholders to drive impactful action. From 2018 to 2023, he spearheaded the creation and deployment of the Ocean Stewardship Coalition at the UN Global Compact, and he also played a pivotal role in developing the Ocean and Coastal Zones program for the UN High-Level Climate Champions, spanning COP26 to COP29. So he's been, doing a lot of work lately. In this capacity, he launched an Ocean Breakthroughs campaign, a transformative effort to drive ocean action across the 3 Rio Conventions. So Ignace, thank you, welcome, and let me start this round of interventions by asking you, how do you work in integrating nature and climate action in the Mangrove Breakthrough Hub? And then, what have been the key learnings in this process? So, Ignace.
Thank you, Carlos. Hola a todos. Nice to be with you. It's a real pleasure. Almost mid-year, in the journey toward COP30 and this important milestone that have been presented by Lina and Carlos. So the work of the Mangrove Breakthrough is, I would say naturally connecting the climate and nature agenda because of the nature of mangrove, this mega superpower ecosystem, which live, between land and sea, and is able to deliver across biodiversity mitigation, adaptation, etc. Right? So for us, when we work on mobilizing capital for mangrove, what we are doing is to look at this array of value that mangrove has, much beyond just a mitigation perspective, right? And so that's been the work we're doing from the very early days of the Mangrove Breakthrough when we launched it at COP27 with governments, financial institutions, NGOs, project developers, is to say we can shift how we are protecting, restoring this ecosystem, and we need to do so by mobilizing a larger pool of capital. To guide us on this journey, at COP28, we launched a finance roadmap for achieving this goal. And I'm really keen to insist, and I know, Lina, you did it, and I'm sure our my good friend and colleague Calder will do it as well, but the pivotal moment that COP28 has been in positioning nature at the center of the climate agenda. We know after COP28, it's very clear to the world that we cannot achieve the Paris Agreement and neither the SDGs overall without fully integrating nature in our plans. And what we're trying to do, with this tiny ecosystem, but as I said, pretty powerful, which are mangrove, is to deep dive into what does this mean for mangrove and coastal communities around the world. What does this mean to better protect, restore, for which benefits, how we can do it? So at the Mangrove Breakthrough, we are at the core of what we're doing is about mobilizing private capital across various streams of financial instruments. But we are also working on two critical pieces that I think are very relevant for this discussion. First of all is around policy. And what we are doing this year in particular is how can we support countries through an NDC task force to have more specific, measurable, science-based targets on mangrove in their NDCs. And that's all about closing this gap or this loop, I would say, around integrating nature in the climate transition plans of country. And so we are doing that through mangrove, but I believe the work we are doing can be an inspiration for including other type of natural ecosystem into NDCs. And we see some countries that are, really leading the charge. It's just a few of them, but we hope that by COP30, when countries will have to present new NDCs, they will be able to have much more that are moving forward on, really valuing coastal ecosystems for their adaptation and mitigation benefits, right? A second element that I wanted to highlight when it comes to this nature climate agenda is more from the non-state actors, private sector perspective. Because we have mainly talked about blue carbon, which is including mangrove. And I think that it's been a mistake, right? Because mangrove, as I said, are valuable in much more other ways than just carbon and mitigation. It's about adaptation, it's about health, it's about obviously biodiversity and food security of the communities living around. So investing in mangrove, the narrative that we are now pushing with the Mangrove Breakthrough and partners, that is not just about mitigation, it's about building the resilience of the people. And that is really, I think, central in how we should approach this nature climate narrative and connectivity, is by showcasing that this is to deliver better place for people to live in and building their resilience to climate shocks, to food stresses, to biodiversity degradation, to health, for instance, right? So with that in mind, what we are doing, and I will conclude with that, is we are working with financial institutions on how we can value mangrove across all of these elements, right? And there is a lot of work that needs to be done to expand this narrative. So investors are not looking only on mangrove for carbon credit benefits, but if an investor is looking into building the adaptation capacity of a certain part of coast, is looking to invest in building the food security of people, in looking to investing in health for coastal communities, then mangrove is an asset that you can value on this journey. So I think for the nature climate agenda, mangrove is a pretty unique ecosystem where we can really demonstrate how this agenda should be connected, right? It's a deep dive and a demonstration that we cannot reach the Paris Agreement again without delivering on the global biodiversity framework and nature protection and restoration.
Well, thank you very much, Ignace. Brilliant. I think that there's a lot of things that we can bring in, to this discussion. You were talking about bringing nature and putting in the center of the agenda, but you also talked about superpower ecosystem. I like that. I really like that because you just said that mangroves are not only for adaptation or blue carbon, but also about food security, about mitigation, and there's a lot of things to talk about that later on. So a great way to start our discussion. Is exciting to hear about the current work you are doing and the opportunities for these critical agendas that the Mangrove Breakthrough Hub is leading. So we will have time now to discuss a little bit more and also about NDCs. You said about NDCs. I think this is the last update just before the 2030 goals. So it's a good time to talk about that. And COP30 definitely will be the scenario. So now I invite Calder, Tsuyuki-Tomlinson, who is the director of the Climate Nature Coordination Platform Secretariat, hosted within Ambition Loop. Calder previously led the Synergies agenda for the UAE COP28 presidency and has supported the development of action agendas for both the UN FCCC and CBD Secretariat. So thank you, Calder, for your participation today. I would like to ask a very similar question for you to share with the audience more of your current work. So, Calder, can you please explain how the Climate Nature Coordination Platform supports the nature and climate agenda? And please, who are the partners you are collaborating with? We have been talking about stakeholders, so I would like to know who are those partners that you are collaborating with and what key learnings have emerged from this process. Please, Calder, welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos, for the very kind introduction and the honor for speaking in this really timely and important webinar. I'm speaking here from Berlin, where we just hosted the Petersburg Climate Dialogue over the last 2 years, with a lot of signals from the incoming COP30 presidency of Brazil, where they were emphasizing the importance on synergies and the convergence of the climate and nature agenda, building very much from the momentum that we saw built at COP28 in Dubai, as Ignace was pointing out, as well as building out from the CBD COP16 process in Cali last year as well, where we're seeing significant momentum given by the new Colombian environment minister around the need for converging these agendas. So I'm the director of this Climate Nature Coordination Platform Secretariat, which really is a new initiative coming out from a political declaration that a group of 25 governments signed at COP28 called the Joint Statement on Climate, Nature and People, brought together 5 different presidencies across the UNFCCC, the CBD, and the UNCCD, so all 3 Rio Convention COPs, across climate, biodiversity, and land degradation, as well as a champion group of 22 other countries that all co-chair different country-led initiatives across climate, land, ocean, and sustainable development as well. So the premise of this gathering was to really have that political declaration on ensuring that the next round of NDCs that countries are now updating in response to the global stocktake are going to be GBF aligned or aligned with the global biodiversity framework and aligned with their national biodiversity plans and strategies, or their NBSAPs, which some countries submitted them last year. Others are still submitting them in the current process. So there's definitely an acute moment right now in advance of COP30 to ensure and encourage and support governments to update their national climate and biodiversity plans in an integrated way. And then, of course, to support an integrated and synergistic implementation as well. And this is really coming from a huge momentum around acknowledging that there can be no success in the Paris Agreement without equal success on the global biodiversity framework. And of course, there are 3 Rio Conventions, so we also have the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and the national instruments for that process are land degradation neutrality targets. And so with governments having to do these different national plans and policies, there's definitely an importance for having a more integrated and synergetic approach to their design and their implementation. Certainly for cost effectiveness, which obviously, as we're seeing in the current climate, there will be a lot of need for that, but then also to be able to mitigate negative trade-offs that might occur. And I think really seeing more momentum within the climate space and of practitioners working on climate policies and advocacy, of understanding why engaging on biodiversity is just as important, and ensuring that we don't have climate policies and practicing a kind of carbon tunnel vision don't negatively impact biodiversity, which usually has spillover effects for local communities and the really important ecosystem services that healthy ecosystems provide. So this climate nature coordination platform is really set out to support the technical implementation of that joint statement, which really is around policy coherence for the next round of national climate policies and biodiversity policies and plans, and synergetic mobilization and deployment of climate and nature finance, data interoperability and synergetic monitoring, review, and reporting, and then of course supporting and encouraging whole society approaches where we see across the action agendas of the different conventions among non-state actors that they are able to approach these challenges without the siloed approaches that are under the different Rio conventions. So already businesses and cities and subnational governments already taking holistic and synergetic approaches. So it's really the signals from governments that they need to work together to be able to utilize these synergies. So we're working together with different implementing IGOs like UNDP that are doing a lot of support for countries' NDCs and NBSAPs, where they've already identified about 50 countries that are doing that integrated approach. Also UNEP, where they're implementing a GEF program, the Net Zero Nature Positive Accelerated Integrated Program. And also the Joint Liaison Group across the Rio Conventions, they have a joint capacity building program, working with other NGOs, including Conservation International, WWF, many other NGOs that are doing this in-country support. And then these other country-led initiatives such as NDC Partnership, NBSAP Accelerator Partnership, the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, and about 15 others, including the Mangrove Breakthrough Hub and the Mangrove Alliance for Climate Action. So we're working to support broader coordination on policy coherence at a global level, and then working with different countries to provide more support in terms of the resources that are available and being able to identify and filling gaps, including on finance and investment, data, MRV work, and then also facilitating coordinated matchmaking amongst these different initiatives to be able to reduce duplication and improve efficiency. I think I'll leave it at there, and then we can get into the details later.
Well, thank you very much, Calder. It's a very, good context, taking into account that we have, here people connected from different countries, different stakeholders, different people from the private sector, the financial sector, NGOs, nonprofit. So it's a good moment to articulate all these issues that you have been talking about during your intervention. So it's great to have your input to learn more about the Climate Nature Coordination Platform Secretariat. And you also talked about policy. So I think now I take this opportunity to go back to Lina Barrera, our keynote speaker, after you read out in both agendas. So now I want to focus on your experience in policy implementation, Lina. I have a question. What policies and regulations are more effective in promoting climate action that impacts nature and the national and international levels? And can you provide some information on the efforts that your team is making for this purpose? Lina, please.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carlos. So, the answer in many ways is simple, right? What we need is really to be protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing nature, right? And that is the crux of the sort of solutions for both biodiversity and climate action when it comes to nature. That said, I think any of us who work in this space, we know that can be very complex, right? So the first step is really for us is making sure that we're using data to really identify the places that are important for both climate and biodiversity, and that governments have this data in hand, and that then they're able to use that to really focus their efforts on those places for conservation and restoration and sustainable management. In the last 2 years, our NBSAP support initiative has actually worked with a dozen or so countries around the world to integrate this kind of data into their NBSAPs. And we've done similar work in supporting countries to develop their nature-based aspects of their NDCs. So as a starting point, that's the most important thing. The other major element that we're thinking about a lot is about providing the right incentives, right? So we've been very active in helping to inform how carbon markets and carbon pricing of different kinds includes nature, and making sure that we're helping to create that positive incentive for sustaining high carbon ecosystems. We're also just right now launching what we call the ARTSI, the Accelerating Rapid Transition of Subsidies and Incentives Initiative. We're very excited about this. We're going to spend about 2 years co-designing this with public and private donors, and we're hoping to launch a fully capitalized grant mechanism at the end of that period. During this initial period of co-design, we're also doing some pilots of really looking at how to reform harmful subsidies, scale up positive incentives for nature, and how we can support and provide resources to civil society and governments in efforts to do that. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Carlos.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Lina. And thank you for, be there, just raising your voice and working on these harmful subsidies, incentives. It's going to be so important for COP30. Now, thank you for sharing the CI's relevant experience in policy implementation. I'm confident that these examples can lead to improved results for our joint strategies on nature and climate. So following this order, I want to ask Ignace and Calder about their efforts to achieve nature and climate ambitious goals in various aspects of their action. So I'm coming to Ignace. Ignace, by using an integrated approach, you mentioned adaptation. So adaptation is a relevant agenda both for climate and biodiversity conservation. So how's the Mangrove Breakthrough Hub supporting this agenda, and what needs to be improved to put adaptation at the forefront of action? Ignace.
Thank you, Carlos. So, obviously, adaptation is a major, and I would say also sensitive issue on the policy front, and we've seen discussion in the previous years on this issue. On when it comes to mangrove, and at the point I made earlier is, I think for us it's how do we value this particular ecosystem and nature in general as an asset to build the resilience, the adaptation capacity, the food security of people. And the work we are doing, for instance, through the design of a dedicated investment facility for mangrove investment with the Mangrove Breakthrough Hub and many partners, we look into how we can channel capital for mangrove, not only for the mitigation potential, so mainly through carbon credit, but also valuing this adaptation, biodiversity, and food security element. And I think for me, this is really critical. When we think about nature, we cannot think in silos around mitigation on one hand and its potential and financial models versus adaptation on the other hand and its model for financing, and then biodiversity in other hand, etc. Right? We have to take this holistic approach and value the ecosystem as a whole. And this is, to me, the only way we can really shift investment into this space. The thing we are looking in doing, for instance, through is how can we, use carbon credit and carbon market and the value of the carbon value of mangrove to serve as a guarantee for developing projects and activities around this mangrove that will benefit local communities, such as fisheries, aquaculture, or ecotourism, right? So you are not selling the carbon credit that you are developing as part of this project and enhancements of mangrove, but you are keeping that as a guarantee for investors to come in and invest in these communities' activities. And things, if this goes well, then that's good. If things doesn't go that well, then you can pay back investors through the carbon credit that has been generated anyway, right? So I think for me, this approach across the value of mangrove, and I think this is a model we can certainly apply to other ecosystem in general, is the way to go. We cannot just invest in mangrove for its adaptation capacity again, right? And I think it's too restrictive and it's not going to work, because in the reality, this ecosystem is beneficial in many fronts. So that's one element to your question. And I think the second point on your question is how do we improve, putting adaptation agenda on the forefront? I mean, it's just because it's about people. And I think for me, this should be the way. And the initial conversation we have with, the political leadership in Brazil and local national organization, it's very much about that, right? It's not just for the sake of climate of biodiversity, but it's how do we build the resilience and elevate people out of poverty in some cases. And that is what the climate, biodiversity, adaptation agenda are made for. And I think we have to make a big effort in our work collectively to really put people much more at the center of the picture. Coastal communities, indigenous people, which play a critical role for maintaining nature overall. I will conclude on that front, but I'm happy to have any follow-up question or hear also from the Calder and Lina on that point.
Thank you, Ignace, very much. And I really like that your position about, putting more more people in the center, because definitely people and nature are connected. And also adaptation. I know that Brazil and among other countries are working very hard on this agenda, not only about adaptations, but also in the mangrove agenda. So thank you very much. And now is the turn of Calder to share more about the efforts made in this regard. So Calder, from your experience in the UAE COP28 presidency, can you share some success stories of examples where integrated climate nature policies have led to significant positive outcomes? Please, Calder.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, I mean, I think that there are many different case studies of successful approaches, and I think that's really what's underscored a lot of the momentum behind nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation as a really concrete and actionable policy tool of advancing really what is a synergetic approach. However, still in terms of the national level policies and plans, in terms of NDCs, in terms of NBSAPs, there's still a lot missing in terms of really seeing more integrated approaches and really a lack of data in terms of being able to assess efforts of actually having a stronger integration. So that's why I think we'll be seeing we're seeing already a lot of efforts in terms of the intention, and then we'll have to see over the coming years how the actual implementation plays out. But it's very clear again that in terms of the taking this approach to address trade-offs in terms of indigenous people, local communities, and land use policies, mineral extraction, and then obviously food systems in terms of spatial uses are incredibly important cross-cutting issues. That there have been other projects that have been more successful on that. And then, of course, as Lina was saying, the subsidies element is a huge elephant in the room. And we're still really not seeing too much momentum there. I think that we're still waiting to see a lot of progress in terms of environmentally harmful subsidies under the Global Biodiversity Framework, and certainly the same thing in terms of fossil fuel subsidies. But in terms of specific case studies, Rwanda, for example, has done some good approaches. There's a study by an initiative called the Economics for Land Degradation, and they looked and assessed Rwanda's coordinated implementation of the land-focused elements of their NDCs, NBSAPs, and land degradation neutrality targets. And it reduced transaction costs for land restoration by approximately 56%, where kind of coordinated implementations estimated to save them at least $45 million a year, which in terms of implementing agencies, that can certainly be quite important in terms of cost effectiveness. Rwanda also has established a national fund for environment, the Rwanda Green Fund, which under one structure mobilizes and deploys finance from different sources synergistically across climate, biodiversity, and land, and really, again, it's just cost-saving elements. Colombia, for example, they've been really leading on more of the design side of things in terms of really taking the time as they're designing their respective NBSAPs and NDCs of really looking down into the details in terms of where the different indicators overlap across climate, biodiversity, and other elements, fulfilling their respective obligations under the different conventions, but then also translating that into actionable pathways for implementation. And Brazil as well is definitely leading that in terms of the scientific basis, in terms of informing their NDCs and NBSAPs, and then also the consultation processes. But they've also recently launched a climate and ecological transformation investment platform, which brings together elements from NDCs and NBSAPs to create really investable pipelines from those. So it's really putting that, really making it alive in terms of the national policies and plans. China also has a good program on an ecological red line, where they're really employing spatial analysis to be able to have a better sense of all the cross-cutting elements across climate, both mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity, land degradation, and local communities in terms of informing both their NDCs and their NBSAPs as well. And then, of course, there are others, as I said earlier, in terms of agriculture. GIZ has been doing a program on scaling up climate ambition and land use in agriculture, which really translates NDCs and NBSAPs into shifting the food systems, and they're doing that across 12 other countries. So there's just a lot of different case studies, and I'll share in the chat different briefs and reports indicating these. So there's a lot to choose from, but there's definitely a lot more work to be done in terms of full integration, especially at the policy coherence level, and then the coordination at the national level across ministries and within ministries for really implementing. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Calder. I was just thinking, you mentioned 3 conventions, and I think that, in 2024 and 2025, there's a lot of things happening in the Global South. I mean, we had G20 in Brazil last year, then we had a biodiversity COP in Cali, and this year we will have the COP30 in Brazil. So it's a very good moment for the Global South, I can see. And now I would like to, to ask one question to each one of you, one for Ignace, and then one for you, Calder, and then I'll go back to Lina, talking about policy coherence, Lina. So Ignace, from the Mangrove Breakthrough endorsement, you build a community of action, and you have mentioned that many times. So could you share key insights from your experience in leading these efforts? And please, Ignace, if you can emphasize a little bit more on that NDC task force that you are working with.
Sure. We can speak about it too, Carlos. No, I'm happy to. Thank you. So yes, I think the work of the Mangrove Breakthrough and where we believe we are bringing a unique added value to the ecosystem of actors already very dynamic on mangrove with NGOs, and we had several project developer on carbon and carbon crediting. Of course, some work from governments across various conventions and at the national level. But what we are doing is that to bring all of these stakeholders together, to work together, to bring their different strengths and capacity in achieving these broader collective goals that we have, that Carlos mentioned at the start, 15 million hectares of mangrove protected and restored by 2030, mobilizing $4 billion. And this is what we call progressive or transformative collaboration, right? We cannot achieve any of these goals if we don't bring non-state actors into the journey that Lina and Calder are developing, right? Government are setting the path forward, are putting regulations, sometimes, putting economic incentive, reducing negative investment that sometimes they make. But at the end of the day, it has to also come from the non-state actors, the investment communities, the cities community, which is, not often sufficiently leveraged, and we are looking into that for mangrove action. Obviously, NGOs and the science community, right? We need this group of stakeholders to really embrace this nature climate journey. It's not easy, but we are seeing some shift, right? We have mega large financial institution like BlackRock, who have issued recently some their strategy on nature investment and how to value nature as an asset in their portfolio. So we see shift. There is major work going on around deforestation free investment portfolio from institutional investors. Of course, the work on mangrove, but it can be replicated, right? But all of this needs to be much more scaled up. When it comes to policy and NDCs, the idea of this NDC task force is how can we convene NGOs mostly and experts organizations that are working on NDCs enhancement to better work together to develop, clear and accessible recommendation and guidance for governments on how to do it, how to integrate mangrove in their NDCs, why they should do it. So we are going to issue these pieces at the end of this early next month or mid-April. So we'll make sure that this is circulated with this group of attendees. And then what these NGOs are also doing is that they coordinate their engagement with government, right? So I think for us, this is also very important that we build, expertise, resources, and capacity, and direct them where there is the most needs, and get our, group of partners better organized. And this is working very well. I think these organizations are seeing value in bringing their different expertise and capacity together, and different, geographical focus. They are learning from each another. And we believe also that governments, more and more in our conversation that we have with Carlos and others, are really seeing the value of these materials and engagement that we are building. So it's all about, rethinking the way we collaborate, bringing people behind a shared set of goals, and it's working, right? Governments and non-state actors are working on this journey, and I hope the work we're doing with mangrove can be replicated to be applied to other ecosystems moving forward.
Well, brilliant, my friend. Great. Now I'd like to go to Calder, and it's about the same thing, Calder. We know in the upcoming month, updates are expected to National Determined Contribution, the NDCs, in line with the Paris Agreement. So can you please share with us what are the main steps the Climate Nature Coordination Platform is taking to support these synergies and facilitate coordinations within sectors? Please, Calder.
Thanks, Carlos. Yes, so the timeline is indeed quite tight, and as indicated before, governments are also still certain governments are still updating their national biodiversity plans and strategies. And so the CNCP Secretariat is and with its partners are really just working to coordinate the most effective means of providing that support. So some of that is really just doing the mapping exercise of which organizations are doing what and where and within which countries, because as we know, countries will be receiving many different requests and offers from NGOs, from those that provide the support, or they might be requesting support, for example, with initiatives like NDC Partnership or NBSAP, et cetera, partnership. So it's really just trying to streamline that engagement, certainly in terms of taking a bit of a strategic approach with that. And then also facilitating all the different resources that are available, because a lot of these stakeholders won't have access to a lot of the resources. They won't have the time to be able to find out all the different resources. So we're working to build out a resource hub, and certainly get that out there as soon as possible, and then really being able to work with other partners for establishing a bit more of a kind of synergies navigator in terms of really understanding how policymakers can implement in a synergistic way. So utilizing AI technologies, and UNDP has really been leading a lot of work on this as well, and working with other partners, including the Nature for Climate Coalition, that are doing a lot of engagement and support in terms of nature and NBS within the next round of NDCs. And so there's the element of trying to support countries directly and facilitate that engagement. At the same time, the CNCP is working very closely with the COP30 and COP16 presidencies of the CBD, so Brazil and Colombia, and really wanting to maximize the opportunities that we have over the next few months towards COP30 in terms of highlighting the importance and raising this politically on the agenda, because sometimes even if technical policymakers are wanting to take more of an integrated approach, they might not always have the understanding, especially from the climate side, of the importance of aligning and integrating, or the importance of biodiversity, certainly in terms of mitigating negative trade-offs. So there's really the importance of being able to build that out. And so obviously we have the Bonn climate sessions happening in June, which will be a major moment. And we can expect a bit more high-level engagement on this topic. The UN General Assembly and New York Climate Week will also be a really important moment, and then the pathway to Belém as well in the lead up. And hopefully we can see a lot more ministers being able to say that they are taking that approach. And we need to socialize with national focal points that engage with these different processes, the better understanding across each other, and that also supporting a bit of a trickle-down effect with the other stakeholders as well. And as for sectors, working with others such as Mangrove Breakthrough Hub and the Mangrove Alliance for Climate that are doing that international support on NDC updates. And so there's the CHAMP initiative, for example, the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partners from COP28. They're also working to support the city's engagement on both NDCs and NBSAPs as well. There's the Technical Collaborative Collective supporting the UA Leaders Declaration on Food systems transformation. So they're also supporting a lot of the NDC updates in terms of food systems. There are also other non-state actor networks such as We Mean Business and the Business for Nature coalitions, working with them in terms of also providing that integrated support more from the business side. So really just trying to map and engage all the different networks and coalitions and partnerships across different sectors to try to transition and build that stronger awareness and the connective tissue across them, and in support of the presidency's agendas as well. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much, Calder. And now, well, we have time for a third question. So I want to ask the same question to everyone here. So I'm going back to Lina. But Lina, I'm going to ask you two questions in one.
Okay.
The first one is that I would like to know more about that policy coherence. What does it mean? Calder was talking about policy coherence too. I know that you have been leading this initiative with Conservation International about policy coherence. So what does it mean? And then, Lina, please, can you mention the 3 top things that need to happen on the road to COP30 and beyond?
Okay. Thanks, Carlos. So when we talk about policy coherence, what we mean is that often governments are investing in the one hand on activities to conserve nature and biodiversity, to implement nature-based solutions to climate change, maybe to restore nature, all of this, which is, fantastic. And then at the same time, they're investing in, for example, deforestation intensive commodity production, right? Or coastal development that destroys mangroves. And all of that then is driving biodiversity loss and emissions from high carbon ecosystems. And so it's like, it's like if you're trying to fill a bathtub, but you leave the drain open, right? You just, there's no coherence there, and it's going to take you much longer to fill up the bathtub. You're probably never going to actually manage it, right? So if what we're after is, a nature positive, climate neutral, equitable world, then we need to bring more coherence to our approaches, right? We can have commodity production and coastal development, and all of these things are possible to do responsibly. It requires work across ministries, and it requires integration of the private sector, as we've all mentioned today. So it's a lot of coordination, but worth it. And I think if we move much more so that that's our foundational approach, is to have this level of coordination, we will, I think, have much better results, both for, the long-term economy and for nature and our climate. In terms of the top things on the road to Belém, to be honest, I think that the most important conversation we're going to see in Belém is the financing roadmap. So the roadmap to 1.3 trillion. This is where we're really going to figure out, how do we pay for all of this? And part of that is policy coherence, right? By reducing spending that is not coherent with the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Global Biodiversity Framework, that actually helps us avoid future costs, and it helps us sort of meet the financing challenge. So I think that really getting that right and making sure that that is encouraging nature-based actions for climate and biodiversity is going to be the most important thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lina. Very clear. Policy coherence, more coordination between governments and ministries. And then, Ignace, I would like to ask you the same question. So what top 3 things that need to happen on road to COP30 and beyond? There's a lot of expectation from the world, I think. So what do you think those 3 things could be?
So, I mean, for me, the first thing is to supercharge NDCs by including nature into them. I think government should see the inclusion of nature as a way for them to supercharge and enhance their NDCs. The second thing is to continue extensively the work, and I think this is really much in the mindset of the COP30 presidency. But how do we better value in our economies, value nature? Sorry, in our economies. We depend on it for our survival, so we have to make sure that the externalities that negative impact and the potential positive impact we have on nature are part of our economic system. That's what we are doing in the specific case of mangrove, but in general, I think there is a big effort that needs to be done by the private sector in general. And the third piece, I think, is to be kind with each another. These days, this is something we need to see much more, and always remind ourselves, and collaborate across sectors and across geographies. That would be my top 3 things. Not easy, but
Yeah. Ignace, no, just let me ask you something. Now we are having, well, in 2 months, we'll have United Nations Ocean Conference in Nice, UNOC. Do you have, I mean, what kind of expectations in this conference? And do you think that we will have an outcome there, or it's like a preparation, or how do you see this conference?
I hope we'll have an outcome. I'm not, from the early discussion I've seen, it's not there yet for UNOC. But I think UNOC are critical, space to position the ocean much more on the global agenda. We know Brazil is, will be represented at the highest level at UNOC, and so I hope we can really build this bridge and this milestone from UNOC, the SDG 14 Ocean Agenda, towards Belém, and again with this idea of how do we bring this nature work and the work around the blue economy and the potential there to support the delivery of COP30, the Paris Agreement, and the enhancements of the NDCs. That's really my hope. And for UNOC, I think it's not time for creating a new set of institutions or a new set of declaration and call to action, but we have to demonstrate results, progress, and how we can build on that to scale them up. And that's really my call for UNOC, because there's been a lot of work going on around SDG 14 in the last year, so we have to take stock and really continue to expand on this journey. We are not there yet. SDG 14 is the least funded of the SDGs still, but we see a shift and a much more interest for this big blue space, which is the ocean.
Thank you, Ignace.
And obviously,
Thank
Nice is a beautiful city in France, so it's a good reason also to come and
For sure, we will be there.
work for the
We'll be
ocean.
there in Nice, yeah, and I'm very positive about the outcomes in UNOC too. So thank you very much, Ignace, Lina, and now the last question to Calder. Same question to you, Calder. Take your time, please. Can you mention the top 3 things that need to happen on the road to COP30 and beyond?
Thanks, Carlos. I guess it's a good confirmation that 2 out of the 3 were already shared by Ignace and Lina. But firstly, really is needing to have ambition with the next round of NDCs. And so, as Ignace said, ensuring nature is there, obviously ensuring that nature included in NDCs isn't coming at the cost of, for example, fossil fuel transition, and energy systems as well. I mean, they have to go hand in hand. But really ensuring that the dimensions of nature are aligned with the global biodiversity framework. And if countries have NVSAPs, then also with their NVSAPs. And obviously with the global stock take, we have the 2030 deforestation target. That will be really critical as well. So obviously mangroves sometimes are defined as forests. I'd love to hear Ignace's thoughts on that, but certainly the deforestation side will be really critical, especially now that we're already seeing tipping points in terms of even just forests serving as carbon sinks, for example. But doing them in a way that really makes them investable. So again, these kind of blueprints, these NDCs that are actionable to non-state actors, and that really give a pathway forward for the fundamental transition and hopefully just transition as well for economies, which again, I think Brazil's leadership in terms of an integrated climate and ecological transformation or transition pathway is really a good model. And then again, engaging broader publics as well, with understanding why this is important and why this delivers for people as well. And so secondly, is really just progress on finance. So Lina talked about the Baku's Belém roadmap, which is absolutely critical. There was no substance in Baku in terms of the element of nature within that. But again, just here with the Petersburg Climate Dialogue, there's an understanding that will be important. And certainly from the CBD side, we just had the second part of COP16 finish in Rome at the end of February, where parties did agree on a resource mobilization strategy, but really the writing on the wall was that a lot of the nature finance that's going to be coming in is going to be connected with climate finance as well. And so there was important progress in terms of having more of an open process of governments understanding how to account for the differences and account for climate and biodiversity financing in terms of transparency, because there's certainly an ongoing concern around the issue of double counting. And so certainly there's need to be able to advance some of the process where the OECD is the main tracker of public donor financing for climate and biodiversity under the Rio markers framework, and really having a better understanding of how to allocate that. And so the Baku to Belém roadmap and the GBF resource mobilization strategy are in certain ways mirrors of each other. And then taking a step back, we need to see more progress on the reform process of the financial system and the international financial architecture. This was initiated last year under the Summit of the Future, or at least it was coalesced under the Summit of the Future for the UN, but really seeing more shifts in terms of debt restructuring on one side, and obviously the geopolitics are very different, especially with the breakdown of world trade. But there's definitely need for shifting there, and that's why we're seeing more movement in terms of climate and nature debt swaps, for example. And then at the same time, as Ignace was saying, with valuing nature within our economics, of really being able to have better understanding and representation of natural capital. And so we've seen some movement in terms of the private sector on that as well, where we need to have good safeguards, especially on international elements on that, which obviously Article 6 under the Paris Agreement provides some structure to, but then also from governments as well. And so we saw a movement last year around Beyond GDP, which is really bringing that element in terms of being able to value, as the Secretary General says, what counts, which includes nature and well-being as well, in a better understanding of what economies are there for to deliver. And that's certainly working within planetary boundaries and delivering for people. And so just the system of national accounts, the full UN international system for national ledgers was just updated recently, and they did make more progress in terms of environmental accounting and natural capital. And then we also have novel mechanisms like the Tropical Forests Forever facility, which Brazil is really working to have as a core outcome for COP30 from the non-negotiated side. But really having a novel, innovative financing mechanism for standing forests can be a potential game changer, but they really need to be able to capitalize it for COP30, especially again, given political headwinds facing into next year. And lastly, is really seeing progress on this connection on the formal processes across the conventions, where in Cali we had this formal decision on climate change and biodiversity. There are going to be submissions of views by governments and other stakeholders on what enhanced policy coherence across the Rio Conventions looks like. That's due in a month from now. And then there'll be presentations in Bonn in June. And really there are certain parties that are wanting to see some acknowledgement of that within the UNFCCC, so that there's a proper ongoing hook for nature and biodiversity within the UNFCCC, because there's Article 5 on forests, but it hasn't been engaged with for the last 10 years. And so really this isn't a moment at COP30 where we can see within the climate space more of a formal understanding and mechanism for recognizing and engaging with the importance of biodiversity and connecting with the other conventions. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much, Calder. And I agree with you. Definitely, financial roadmap will be one of those points and issues that we need to talk a little bit more, a very deep conversation, because governments and organizations are waiting for these issues and topics. And then carbon markets, debt swaps, a lot of governments, national governments, and also subnational governments are asking about how to do it. And then I think that COP30 will be a good time to talk about this too. then policy coherence, nature, how to connect the agendas. And well, now it's time to close this rich discussion on how to act effectively for nature and climate, among other synergies on the road to COP30. I want to thank you, Conservation International, to the team. Thank you very much for all the support. Thank you, Ignace. Thank you, Calder, for taking this time to speak with us today. And as we look ahead, it's essential to embrace a more integrated approach to addressing our interconnected crisis. To build a nature positive and low carbon future, we must move beyond fragmented efforts and adopt a transformative collective strategy. Policymakers, financial institutions, NGOs, philanthropists must unite in pursuit of both our domestic and international environmental goals. So COP30 presents a pivotal moment for global action and multilateral cooperation. It is not only an opportunity to meet the objective of the Paris Agreement, but also to advance in the goals outlined in the Global Biodiversity Framework and tackle other critical social and environmental challenges. As we have heard from our distinguished speakers today, while progress is being made, we must scale up global efforts to level and urgency required to meet our domestic and international targets. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the path to Belém. Thank you very much.